People's University. If you wouldn't mind turning your cell phones off, please do that now. As you can see, we have more printed copies of the Upper Ohio Valley Historical Review, Wheeling in 50 Objects. They raised my printing price, so I have to charge you another $1 there, $6. But that's still just break even for us, so I hope you get one. And next Tuesday on Valentine's Day, Paul Robeson will be here. The gentleman's name is Marvin Jefferson, and he's an actor from New Jersey, actually. And he does a historical portrayal of Robeson. If you don't know who Robeson was, he was a bass baritone concert artist, stage and film actor, professional football player, and an activist. So that'll be Tuesday at noon. And the following Tuesday, we'll have the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells. Her name is Michele Duster, and her books are up here. We'll have those for sale at a very reduced price. Next Thursday, we will talk about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, so don't miss that. Our instructor, all the way from Huntington, is here again. Dr. Laura Michele Diehner has taught ancient and medieval history at Marshall University since 2008. She's won several awards for teaching and received her PhD from The Ohio State University. Here she is, Laura Michele Diehner.
Hello again. Welcome back. Thank you for having me. I have to say, every week I listen to these events. I am so impressed by Wheeling. Like, Wheeling is clearly a city that loves history. I'm like, Paul Robeson, Ida B. Wells, like, this is amazing. So this is the first of 3 sessions that we are going to do covering Rome. Now, the way I decided to divide it is that tonight we are going to do sort of fun facts about life in Rome. I thought we'd take a break from some of the wars, the conquests, the assassinations, the bloody, murderous weddings and all of that, and look at, life for ordinary people as far as we can tell, and also look at some kind of myths and origin stories. Next week, we're going to focus on Rome, the empire, and how it got so big and the various political stages it went through. And then the very last session, I want to do kind of a deep dive into Pompeii and look at a lot of the artifacts, the written records about what happened, look at what's been going on in the city since then. So that is my current plan, but I'm also open to revisions if people have questions or things they really want to know about. And in fact, I'm revising things right now. Someone just asked where I was going to start, and I haven't even decided because I was going to begin at the beginning as far as I could and talk about the Etruscans, sort of the great Italian power before the Romans. However, all my beautiful images that I promised you apparently didn't transfer, and Google Drive hates them, and my flash drive's not working, so we're just skipping the Etruscans. We'll do them next week. And so this is actually the only image you will see, and I understand that it's blurry, which is actually kind of the point. The whole reason it's there is just to show you the bigness of Rome and where we're going to get to. So that we are going to start with tiny little area in Italy, and just an area of kind of farmer warriors, and then look at how they got to be so huge, and why and how that hugeness affected culture, long after the Roman Empire itself falls. Although, if it really did it really fall, that's still a debate. We say the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. I'm not sure it fell ever. Maybe it just transformed. That's a debate we'll talk about next class. So, for today, I want to talk about what the Romans believed in, what they believed about themselves and about their past. Now, as with all of these cultures that we've been discussing, it's very difficult to talk about the early years because we simply don't have the sources for it. Our main source for the history of Rome before the Republic and the founding of the Republic comes from histories written by Romans living in a much later period. The main one is written by Titus Livius, short Livy for short. He is living during the time of Julius Caesar and then going into Emperor Augustus. So he's born roughly 64 BC, something like that. The traditional date for the founding of the Roman Republic is around 509 BC. And so we pretend that he's a source, but really that would be like saying if I wrote a book about about the Middle Ages, that I'm a primary source. Maybe in 10,000 years I will be, but I'm not now. So Livy tells us not so much about what really happened in early Rome, but about what later Romans thought happened, which actually is really interesting because we get a sense of the way Romans saw themselves in history, the way they saw themselves in relation to other ancient cultures, other ancient stories, and also the qualities they believed that they possessed. So if you read the earliest books of Livy, you get this series of absolutely fantastic stories that place the Romans in the midst of some of the greatest dramas of the ancient world. Now, every culture pretty much seems like that I talk about or study wants to be connected to the Trojans. They want to be connected to the Trojan War. And it's easy to see why, even if you've never read Homer, you know about the Trojan War, you know about the term Trojan horse. When I came up here, I was listening to a murder mystery, a Scottish murder mystery, and they were using the story of the Trojan horse. I mean, it's just everywhere in our culture. The same was true in the ancient world. Alexander the Great, who we talked about last class, loved the Trojans and the Greeks and the stories of Homer. He kept a copy of the Iliad with him. He wanted to be like Achilles. Achilles was his hero. The Romans weren't any different, and they believed that they were descended from the Trojans. So how did that work? Because the Trojans were destroyed, their city was destroyed. But according to the Roman version of events, the night that the city of Troy burned down, all the men were slaughtered, all the women were rounded up and taken prisoner, a few people escaped and survived. In particular, a hero named Aeneas, who was the son of a priest, Anchises, and the goddess Aphrodite. So he was half mortal. And his mother comes to him and ensures that he escapes along with his father, a few straggling survivors, and his young son. And they go off on these wild adventures, and eventually they come to the shores of Italy. And that's where they land and they try and make a home. And Aeneas ends up marrying a princess named Lavinia, who is the princess of one of the tribes that's living there. And they have to fight other groups, but eventually Aeneas unites them all and he becomes a king. And then it's through his sons that we get some of the first rulers in Italy. His son founds a city called Alba Longa, and Livy tells the story of this line continuing. Now, why would the Romans want so much to be part of the Trojan story? There's probably a lot of reasons. The Trojans are sort of these old, amazing heroes. And if you can connect yourself to them, then your history automatically becomes magnificent. So the Romans aren't alone in this. When I teach about medieval Ireland, there's actually a medieval Irish history that says on the way to Italy, Aeneas stopped in Ireland and had some children, and he was there. There's a version of that for Britain as well. So a lot of cultures wanted to be connected to the Trojans in some ways. Now, This is especially important considering when Livy himself was writing, because he's writing at a time when when Augustus is becoming an incredibly important ruler, and Augustus traces his origin, at least by adoption, to the Julii clan. And the Julii clan had always claimed to be descended, not just from the initial immigrants coming over from Troy, but in fact from the line of Aeneas himself. So by glorifying Aeneas and his exploits, he's actually glorifying the current political regime as well, which is always a smart thing to do. Now, according to Livy, the line prospers, and eventually we get to two brothers who are going to be kings of Alba Longa, Amulius and Numitor. This is all just the first section of Livy. And it's Numitor who is going to inherit the throne, but of course, like all brothers, Amulius, he's jealous, he overthrows his brother, he seizes control of the throne himself, and Numitor's only child, a daughter named Rhea Silvia, he forces to become a Vestal virgin, so she will never have any issue. Now, Rhea Silvia is then raped by the god Mars, or someone claiming to be the god Mars, or Livy tries to tell a lot of different versions, like everything he's heard. So he says it could have been the god Mars, it could have been somebody claiming to be the god Mars, or else she just claimed it was the god Mars. But definitely throws in the godlike aspect, which is good because we've already got some immortal blood coming from Aphrodite. And she gives birth to twin boys. And when her evil uncle finds out, of course he wants the boys to be killed, and he has them drowned. But of course, this is a founding myth. It's not true. They wash up on the shore of the Tiber, and eventually they are kept alive by a kindly she-wolf who comes and suckles them. Now, that part of the story I think is very important for how the Romans saw themselves. Wolves are proud, they're fierce, they're independent, and so the fact that some of their early Romans were deemed worthy to be raised by she-wolves is very important in their myth. And eventually they are taken in by a kindly shepherd who raises them. Now, the story progresses the way you would think it would. Eventually, they discover their destiny. The twin boys, they're named Romulus and Remus, and they end up overthrowing their evil uncle, restoring their grandfather, and eventually deciding to found a city of their own, not the same as Alba Longa, and this is the city of Rome. And you'll notice it's not called Rome, it's called Rome. So there are several versions of how this happened. So in one of the versions, Romulus and Remus stand on two different hills and they wait for a sign. Now, this is a common practice in Roman religion that they actually get from the Etruscans, who we'll talk about next class. This idea that you can read the will of the divine in the sky based on omens, and there's a whole school of knowledge devoted to figuring out how to interpret those omens. So first off, Remus sees 6 vultures, and he says, okay, that's what we're looking for. I am destined to be the king of this new city. And then Romulus sees twice as many vultures, and they come together and they start arguing because Remus saw them first, and then Romulus saw more. So it ends up with Romulus killing Remus, and then he calls his city Rome, not Rheme, and gets to be the first king. The other version is that Romulus builds a wall. He starts building a wall around the city, and he says, I will bring death and destruction to anyone who dares cross my wall. And then, again, this kind of rings very true to me, even though it's a myth, because I have 2 children, so I can see them doing this. Immediately, Remus says, well, I'll go ahead and cross your wall, and he jumps over it, and then Romulus kills him. So in either version of the story, Remus ends up dead, and Romulus ends up becoming king. Now, the Romans believed in that, but that idea of brotherly fighting, and I should say, I don't actually think my kids would kill each other. I can just see them trying to climb over the wall. But that idea of brothers fighting, I think, would have a very immediate meaning for readers of Livy's history. Even if they know it to be an old myth, they couldn't help but apply it to their own times, because when Livy is writing, the Romans have lived through multiple generations of civil wars, usually led by people who were related, frequently through marriage, through alliance. So the idea of brothers turning on each other, I think, would have real poignancy for that. So Romulus becomes the first king of this new city, Rome. Now, right away, he needs people for his city, and he ends up basically opening it up, and we get a lot of landless people kind of wandering, young men mainly, who are looking to make their fortunes. He opens the city to them, and they all come and join him and his friends and become the first inhabitants. So right away, there's this idea that Rome is a place of opportunity, that it's a place for people with will and spirit and character and a desire for adventure. So, it's not a place, where sort of older people sit and let things happen. It's a place full of dynamic individuals, but they are all men. So what are they going to do? Romulus sends out messages to all the neighboring people saying, I have all these entrepreneurial young men, we need wives, I need a wife, send us your daughters, basically. We would like to seek your daughters in marriage. Now, the Romans had kind of a bad reputation as these sort of young, scruffy ruffians with their sort of peasant king, and the neighbors politely decline. So Romulus ends up leading his men, and they end up going to this festival, and this section in Livy is traditionally known as the rape of the Sabine women, rape as in raptus, like the Latin for sort of carrying off, and they go, and then they have the sort of prescribed signal, and at the right moment, they take all of these young women and they bring them back to Rome, and they marry them. Now, if any of you like old musicals, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers kind of mimics that plot, and they even have a song about that. So the Sabine women are living at Rome, and then what happens is it takes their families about a year or so to get organized and to get allies to come and get their daughters back. And by the time they come, all of their daughters are happily married to their Roman husbands, they have children, and it's actually the Sabine women who come out and stop the war and say, you are either going to kill, nothing good will come of this war. Either our husbands will die, the fathers of our children will die, or our own fathers will die. So we want to stay here and we want you to make peace. Now, that story probably tells us a few different things about the way the Romans saw their origins. They were aware that they were not a closed society. It was very important for Romans to have the right ancestors. There were certain families that were very prominent. There were certain clans that were very prominent. It was a great thing if you could trace your family very far back. But at the same time, the Romans were open. People could come in as slaves even later and eventually gain freedom and wealth and citizenship. So as a society, they tended to flourish through foreign influence, I would say. And also, we see that the Sabine women are important actors in this story. Now, that doesn't mean that the Romans treated their women equally or gave them equal rights or anything like that. They certainly did not have, legal, political, social status the way men did. But the Romans did believe that women could have honor, and they could act with honor or without honor. So we see women being important actors in a number of these early stories, which differs from, say, like the ancient Athenians, who really believed that women were sort of like overgrown children and couldn't really make good decisions and couldn't really have honor. So we see this again later on in Livy, where several kings later, we have this horrible king, King Tarquin, who is just this vicious tyrant, and he has a son, Prince Tarquinius, who is equally horrible, and he's the heir to the throne. And he ends up falling in love with this noble woman, Lucretia, who is already married. And he's at this party with all the men of Rome, and they have this contest to see who has the most virtuous wife. And so they go and they visit all the wives in the middle of the night. And some of them are sleeping and some of them are throwing their own parties. But Lucretia is up in the night spinning wool like a good virtuous wife. So the prince sees her and decides he must have her. So he arranges for her husband to be sent away on, because they're at war. And then he comes upon her at night and he tries to seduce her and she says no. And he says, well, you're going to have to, because if you don't submit to me, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill one of your male slaves, and then I will tell everybody that I caught you with your male slave, and thus I killed you to preserve your husband's honor. So she submits to him, but then later calls all the male members of her family together, tells them what happens, says she cannot live with this dishonor, and she stabs herself to death with her father's sword. And that action is the traditional moment of the founding of the Roman Republic, because her father, her male relatives, her husband, all of their friends decide that they can no longer live in a society where such horrible things can happen to women, where kings can have such power that they can abuse, the most innocent, the people who most need the protection. So they join together and they overthrow the Tarquins, and they begin the Roman Republic, which is based on the idea of shared power among a number of equal men. So it's not a democracy, but it's based on the idea of shared power and an abhorrence to tyranny, to the idea that someone can just exercise control without any kind of check or balance. Now, whether or not that story is true, it's probably not true, at least in those details. It again shows us that the Romans believed that women, as well as men, could act with honor, that they had honor. If their honor was lost, then they could reclaim it through a noble death. And for the Romans, the way to die nobly was to fall on your sword, as opposed to poison, which is sort of a cowardly, negative way out. So jumping forward to the famous story of Cleopatra, she kills herself with poison, and according to our various sources, we don't really know. But that kind of death just evoked, negative, feminine, foreign connotations. It was not a noble, bold Roman way to go. That would be to fall on your sword, really. So those are some of the earliest stories that we have about the Romans. And they don't necessarily tell us what actually happened, but they allow us to see what was important to the Romans. Honor, toughness, independence, shared power, hatred for tyranny, belief in community and family and shared power. And some of these values are talked about frequently in Roman sources for centuries to follow. So we have the word libertas is a Roman word, liberty, this idea of freedom from tyranny, or pietas, which is respect for the gods, which is very important. If you respect the values of Rome, then you respect the gods. And the idea of shared power is incredibly important. So you sometimes see the abbreviation SPQR, and one of the books I recommended was SPQR. So that stands for, it's an abbreviation in English for the Senate and people of Rome. It's Senatus Populusque Romanorum. And the Senate and people of Rome is a way of saying in just a few words what Rome was based on, shared power. So you notice the people are in there, which is unusual because if you think back to our Egyptian lectures, you probably don't remember any of the kings caring all that much about what the people thought about anything. They were really not that involved. The only people that mattered were sort of the ones at the top. If you think about Alexander the Great and the Macedonians, they were more interested, but only in specific people and in making sure people in general didn't rebel. There was not this interest in sharing power with the people, which is pretty typical for the ancient world and many other societies. But the Roman Republic believed in the importance of shared power that included the populace, the people. Now, by people, they did not mean all people. Most of us would not qualify. They meant adult male citizens. So it's not that they didn't think women and slaves were people, but they were not the populace. They were not part of the people who deserved shared power. But this is still pretty novel for the ancient world, the idea that there should not be one king, that power should be shared around. So how did that work in practice? So with the Republic, there were basically three groups among which the power would be shared. There were the people, the Senate, and the magistrates. So the senators are appointed. Magistrates are elected, and everybody has fixed terms, the idea being that no one should stay in power long enough to become a tyrant. So the populace votes. They vote on the magistrates. The two kind of most important of the magistrates would be the consuls. So there's two consuls that are elected, and there's two of them so they can balance each other out. So we have the consuls. They are magistrates who are elected, but we also have the Senate, and the Senate consists of several hundred people who are meant to advise the consuls on what to do. So the consuls make the decisions, but they have to make them based on what the Senate advises. And the consuls can't go against the Senate. They can, but then they'll never get reelected. And in order to be elected in the first place, you also have to appeal to the populace. So there's this idea of shared power and a hatred of tyranny. And the worst kind of tyrant is just that term king, rex. So if you call somebody a rex and you're a Roman politician, that is like the worst insult. It's like calling somebody a Nazi today in government. You're basically saying you have no respect for law. You do not belong in our system, which is interesting, of course, because we all think of the Roman emperors. And Roman emperors certainly seem a lot like kings. And those early Roman emperors have to figure out a way to market themselves so that they're not kings, which is why they never use the term rex, which is kings. That's very negative. Emperor, which to us signifies great, magnificent power, that actually it comes from imperator, which is it just means like commander. It's much more of a non-royal kind of military term. And so it was meant to basically say, I am not a king. I'm in power, but I am absolutely not a king. So, okay, I made that go away, but that's all right. In addition to respect for the gods, respect for liberty, respect for shared power, the Romans also believed in respect for their family and their community. And one of the best ways to see this is simply by looking at Roman naming practices. And so I have given you a fun handout. It's the second page. The system of Roman naming. Now, it can be very frustrating to read through Roman sources because everybody has the same name. And there's a reason for that. Today, we name our children because we want them to stand out as individuals. So we name them, really unusual things for the most part, like, I don't know, Apple or something like that, like kind of celebrity names. Or we name them to honor someone we really cared about. But Romans didn't really have a choice in their names. How you were named was already prescribed for you. So the main part of your name actually reflected your clan or your gen's name, sort of the larger, huge family group that you came from. And so the best example is Gaius Julius Caesar, because he's probably the most famous Roman. So that's his full name, Gaius Julius Caesar. He is from the Julii clan. And so all the males in his clan will have the name Julius to show that they are from the Julii clan. That connects them all together. And all of the males in his family will also have the same praenomen. So Gaius. So his father was named Gaius. If he had a legitimate son, he would also have been Gaius. Now, Caesar is a cognomen. Those came about a little bit later because we started to get, population expansion in Rome. So there were just too many, just Gaius Julius's or, Quintus Fabius's. And so those clans got so huge that they started to divide. So your cognomen kind of indicated what branch of that clan you were from. So the Caesar branch of the Julii clan. Later, we even get agnomens, which can be added on usually as an honorific. That's where sort of the individuality aspect, we start to see that later, came in. They would sometimes represent a victory, either by yourself or your family. So Britannicus, for example, was the agnomen of Emperor Claudius's son because he had conquered Britain. So Germanicus referred to conquest in Germany. So we start to get those names added on. Africanus refers to Scipio Africanus, who was a hero of the Punic Wars. Now, this meant, of course, that if you had 5 sons, they were all going to have the exact same name. How do you call them? How do you distinguish them? You give them numbers. So, Primus, Secundus, Tertius. If you've got 7 sons, then, you have 7 Gaius Julius Caesars, and you number them. And now, if you have daughters, it becomes even more confusing because women only had one name, and that was their clan name. So Julius Caesar's daughter was named Julia. That was her only name. Now, if he'd had 10 daughters, they all would have been named just Julia. Again, they would have been numbered. Now, a famous example is Mark Antony. Everybody's heard of him, Antony and Cleopatra, all of that. So he had 2 daughters with his wife, Octavia, Antonia the elder and Antonia the younger, or Antonia Major and Antonia Minor, basically. So that actually makes it very hard for anyone trying to construct a Roman genealogy to figure out who anyone is if all you know is that someone had a wife named Julia. That really doesn't help you. That makes it pretty difficult. But the names reflect the way the Romans wanted to be seen and the way they saw themselves. Sure, they could be individuals that could be reflected in their careers and in their accomplishments, but most important was who they were. If you meet someone and his name is Gaius Julius Caesar or Paulus Livius Nero, picking and choosing from there, you immediately know who they are. You know that they are a Roman citizen. If you meet somebody named, sorry? Yes, great example, Vercingetorix, or Ptolemy, that they are not Roman. They are not part of that core Roman group. They're not a citizen. And depending on their name, they may or may not be free, because freedmen would have taken a Roman name, when they become free, usually the name of someone who freed them or a former master or something like that. So it was important for the Romans to identify themselves as who they are. Your name gives you status. Now, for women, obviously, it's a lot less important for them to identify who they are. The most important thing about women was their clan. And so all you needed to know about women was basically that they were Roman and who their family was. So that tells us a lot about the way the Romans saw themselves within family groups. Now, we actually know not as much as we would like, but a lot about Roman families. A number of Romans, particularly in the later Republic, wrote letters back and forth. Not all of them have survived, but when they have, they're really interesting. We have the letters, for example, of Marcus Tullius Cicero. So you can already tell what clan he's from, all of that you already know. If I told you Marcus Tullius Cicero has a daughter, what's her name? Julia. Yes, exactly. So he wrote a number of letters back and forth to his brother, to friends, to his family. So we can get a sense of Roman family life. We also know a number of laws. In particular, we know about law codes that came in particular under the Emperor Augustus. And so those are later, but because we know about them, we can then reflect back on how they've changed. So one thing that we know is very important for Roman families was the paterfamilias. You've probably heard that term. We actually use it all the time. What does paterfamilias mean? Yeah, family father. And the paterfamilias was the center of the family. And that, not just in a kind of affectionate leadership way, but legally the head of the family. Now, the Roman family was not our nuclear family. It was more of this larger sort of Mediterranean sense of a family. It included not just biological group, but all the dependents, the householders, the servants, the slaves, the guards, everybody affiliated would be part of the larger family. And the paterfamilias had legal control over everyone. Now, in Libby, very strange, it's like a ghost of myself. I might move over here, see what happens. It looks very strange. And I'll try to move over. There's a story about Marcus Junius Brutus, who was one of the leaders of that revolution. Republic, and actually his because they're your children, and he said, no, I'm a Roman first, and executed them. We get lots of stories like that. There's a story of a father and all of his sons die in battle, one after the other, against the enemy, but his daughter was in love with one of the enemy warriors, so she was upset at that an enemy had died, and so the father killed her as well. This was all kind of good parenting, and legally fathers could do those things. Now, I don't know that was really reality. That Roman fathers went around killing their children for disobedience. I think it was more they were apocryphal stories to express how much better things had been in the old days when children listened and everybody had values. Certainly when we get into individual families through their letters, we see that parents put up with quite a lot of disobedience from their children and did not kill them. Cicero, for example, had his daughter Tullia, who he absolutely adored. She was the apple of his eye. He thought she was the smartest, most delightful human being. And for her third husband, she wanted to marry this man, Dolabella, and his wife wanted her to marry Dolabella. Cicero absolutely did not want that. In many letters, he emphatically says, over my dead body will not happen. I don't care what happens, as I am a Roman man, she will not marry Dolabella. Of course, she marries him, and that's just the way things were. So, in individual family circumstances, the paterfamilias could, bend because of love or affection or something like that. But legally, the father did have a huge amount of power. However, mothers could also have power. For one thing, mothers could leave their property to their children, which meant that, their sons, their daughters had reason to be nice to them and to respect them. Also, wives, in some cases, could divorce their husbands. There were two kinds of Roman marriages that we know of. There's a marriage known as cum manu marriage, which is marriage with a hand. And it basically means that a paterfamilias is handing his daughter over to the control of her husband or her husband's paterfamilias. He's basically giving her into another family. Now, that was probably an earlier form of marriage. As we get into the late Republic, as we'll talk about in another class, the Romans got richer. They got a lot richer. And when your daughter married, you'd be giving a huge dowry along with her. You're not necessarily just going to hand all of that over to some other family. So another form of marriage developed known as sine manu marriage, which means without a hand. I'm giving you my daughter and her dowry for now, as long as things go okay, but we all reserve the right to change our minds. And so an unhappy wife could divorce her husband, particularly if she had her family's backing, and her dowry would come right back with her. So if her husband or her husband's family didn't want to lose her dowry, then they had to keep her happy. And if women were widowed repeatedly, they might accumulate not just dowries, but inheritance, and they might become very wealthy. That was not untypical because of the way that the ages of Roman marriages typically worked. Young Roman men didn't marry terribly young, particularly if they were citizens, if they were going to be educated, if they were going to go into politics. They would have to spend a lot of time getting educated, learning not just literacy, but the art of rhetoric, the art basically of how to argue, because that's something you would have to do as a politician. They might spend some time in the army. They might get themselves established. They might not marry until they were in their early 30s. That might be when they're in a position to be married. Women, however, could marry basically as soon as they could bear children. So a first marriage between two people might be between a teenage girl and a man in his early 30s, which would mean that a woman might go through several husbands during her lifetime. So Tullia, again, for example, Cicero's daughter, had 3 husbands. She actually died at quite a young age in childbirth, but she outlived her first 2 husbands. And so we see that frequently. Now, the flip side of that is that young women could also die in childbirth. So Tullia did eventually die in childbirth. Julius Caesar's daughter died in childbirth. She, however, her first marriage was married to Caesar's ally, Pompey the Great, and it was his third or fourth marriage, I don't remember offhand, he was even older than her father. But that was kind of a typical first marriage. Now, let's see. So we have the paterfamilias. Now, given all of this, the importance of family, the importance of the paterfamilias, the importance of his wife, it's not surprising that Roman worship traditions were bound up with the idea of the family being a central unit. So when we think about Roman religion, at least the way I learned it when I was in school, it was very much that the Romans simply adopted the Greek gods and gave them different names. You know, Zeus became Jupiter, that basically they worshiped the Olympian gods under different names. That's how I always learned it. But it was more complicated than that, of course. The Romans had their own religious traditions long before they adopted the Olympian gods. And my notes got a little out of order here, but the original, like the earliest Romans, the Romans that Livy is writing about, they tended to worship nature a great deal, by which I mean they worshipped the spirits of their natural environment. So water, bodies of water, a spring, a grove of trees, those would all be considered to be animated into spirits, and they would be worshipped. So there's descriptions of prayers that people would say before, say they would cut down a grove of trees, where they would make an offering and thank the deity of that particular grove of trees. There's a really interesting description in a letter by a Roman named Seneca. If you have ever come upon a thick grove of ancient trees which rise far above the usual height and block the view of the sky with their umbrella of intertwining branches, then the height of the forest and the seclusion of the spot and the wonder of so dense and uninterrupted a shade out of doors creates in you a belief in deity. We venerate the sources of great rivers. We build altars where large streams of water suddenly burst forth from hidden regions. We worship hot springs, and we consecrate certain lakes because of their darkness or depth. And that idea of individual places being animated by spirit would extend to an individual farm, for example. Every farm would have its own spirit. So a lot of religious ceremonies involve, pleasing local spirits, praising the spirit of a particular farm, for example, before the harvest. Now, the family was the center of this. So every family would have its own household gods. They would be it would be like a little shrine in every house. And they would be represented by the genius and the Juno, basically the spirit of the father and the mother, the male and the female spirits of that particular family and that particular house. So we think of these sort of Olympic temples or Olympian temples to Mars and all of that, and they certainly had them, but they also worshipped on a very local and familial level as well. And so, for example, the Lars of a particular family, it would be in your house, and they could be decorated with garlands, or a family would sacrifice animals to them on certain key days throughout the year. Now, there would be prayers before harvesting. So there's a great description of a prayer by Cato the Elder, who wrote a book on agriculture. Before you harvest your crops, you should offer a sow as a preliminary sacrifice. And he then talks about which gods you have to invoke, what you have to say. After you sacrifice the sow, you cut off the internal organs in a particular way, and you offer the organs and wine to different gods and goddesses. Now, That brings about another key value that we see, respect for gods, pietas, and that's embodied at every level. So you can see it almost reflected in a Roman name. Your family has to respect the gods. Your clan has to respect the gods. You have to respect the gods. And respect for the gods is something that has to happen at every single level. That's where we get our word piety, reverence for them. And respect tends to occur in the form of sacrifices. So you have your household gods, you might sacrifice to them, but then there's also the community gods, and then there's the state gods. So the family will sacrifice to their individual gods, but they will also participate in sort of the larger festivals in honor of important gods where the sacrifices will take place in front of temples. Now, one of the I think more intriguing and bizarre aspects of Roman religion that people always bring up is deification, the idea of making somebody a god. So we all know that Julius Caesar became a god, Augustus became a god, that Roman emperors and their relatives would actually become gods. And to us, that seems like kind of a ludicrous idea. How does that work? Did they really believe in that? But when we think about what Roman religion involved, it involved respect, sacrifice, public celebration, statues or small shrines or large temples, some kind of commemoration, then that makes sense. If somebody dies, they can become a god because that's what you could do for them. You could have public ceremonies where you sacrifice animals and say prayers in their honor and have a statue and a building for them. So that makes sense. I mean, we honor a lot of people who are deceased that way as well. We just don't call it deification. But in that sense, we can see how someone would die and be made into a god and what that might mean. All right, so in the last little bit of time, I want to actually talk about another group of Romans who were part of the larger family, but not necessarily part of the biological unit. And those were the slaves. And there were a huge amount of slaves in Rome as the empire gets larger. So when the Romans start off as these farmer warriors, slaves are not a huge part of their labor force. It's only later, after they expand into the old Carthaginian Empire, and then they start conquering all the Hellenistic kingdoms, that all of these places tended to run on slave labor. Plus, they will have captives, captive soldiers, all of that. And that basically brings a huge influx of slaves into Rome. Now, slaves really ran the gamut in terms of experiences. So you could become a slave at a mine. We have a description, and I think it's on one of the handouts I gave you, actually. Yes. A description of slaves who worked in the silver mines, and it is complete and utter cruelty and degradation. So this is coming from the historian Diodorus Siculus. They are physically destroyed, their bodies worn down from working in the mine shafts both day and night. Men die because of the excessive maltreatment they suffer. So we have slaves who are just subject to extreme cruelty, who don't really mix with the rest of society. And then we get slaves who are part of familia, and we can see their status shift as they sometimes move around in the familia. That's because Roman slavery was not based on race or class. It tended to be based, I don't know what class, it tended to be based mainly on circumstance. If you were captured and you became a slave, then you were a slave, but you could also be free. Like you could buy your own freedom, or someone else could buy your freedom, and then you were a freed person, and your status could continually improve. So you weren't destined to always be a slave. Now, that brings up some kind of interesting insights into the way the Roman familia worked. So it's hard to get, evidence of how this would work. I mean, we don't have, for the most part, stories or histories telling us about Roman slaves. But occasionally, we find these little mini biographies, usually as funeral inscriptions. So there will be a monument and it will have an inscription to a former slave or a deceased slave. And I just included a few just to show you the variety of experiences. So one of these is, it's at the very bottom of your handout on the page that's got all the quotes. And it says, "Here lies Vitalis, first a slave, then the son of Gaius Labius Faustus. I was born in his home as a slave. I lived 16 years and I was a salesman in a shop. I was pleasant and well-liked, but I was snatched away by the gods. I beg you, travelers and passers-by, if ever I shortchanged you to bring more profit to my father, please forgive me. And I beg you, by the gods above and below, that you treat my father and mother with kindness and respect. Farewell." So that was obviously put up by his adoptive parents that had formerly been his owners. We also have above that a funerary inscription of a freed woman, a former slave. "Furia Spes, freed woman of Sempronius Firmus, provided this memorial for her dearly beloved husband. When we were still boy and girl, we were bound by mutual love as soon as we met. I'd lived with him for too brief a time. We were separated by a cruel hand when we should have continued to live in happiness. I therefore beg, most sacred Manes, protective spirits, that you look after the loved ones I have entrusted to you, and that you be well disposed and very kind to him during the hours of night, so that I may see him and so that he too may wish to persuade fate to allow me to come to him softly and soon." So I just gave you a few samples to show really the rich variety of Roman life that existed. We certainly don't have all of the sources and stories that we would want to have, but we do have enough to consider just the huge expanse of individual lives that existed within Rome and the larger empire. And so I think that's one of the reasons people are so interested in Rome. It is the ancient world. It has sort of the glamour, the exoticism of, Homer's Troy, or ancient Egypt, but it's also very human and very immediate to us because we do have these fantastic sources that make these people seem like characters in a novel or people we can encounter in letters. So I think that's part of the continuing attraction of Roman people for us. So this was just a very, very kind of quick overview of some of what I think are sort of the most interesting approaches to Roman history, particularly Roman social history. And next class, we're going to look into, well, okay, this is sort of the their deep dive into what people's experiences were like. How was Rome becoming Rome? What was the context by which we started off as these sort of farmer warriors, and then eventually we become this huge empire where we absorbed all the Hellenistic kingdoms and expanded into Britain and North Africa and up to the Rhine and the Danube. So I think I'm going to leave it at that for now, and I will go ahead and answer some questions. Yes?
Was Julius Caesar born on C-section?
He was not. There's a story, there were popular stories in the Middle Ages that he was, and there's actually medieval manuscripts depicting his birth that give a depiction of what a C-section might look like. They're not very realistic. I might try and find some and show them to you next time. But no, he was not, because ancient and medieval C-sections, for the most part, pretty much ensured the death of the mother, and Caesar's mother was a powerful force. She outlived his father, so he became his own paterfamilias when he was quite young, and his mother was a big force in his life. At one point, he is on the run because he is outlawed. It's during one of the civil wars, and it's when he's very young, and it's his mother who intercedes for him and gets him sort of a hearing with Sulla, who is the one who has outlawed him. And so his mother was very much alive, so no. But it is an interesting story that appears in the Middle Ages. Yes?
Talking about the naming of children, naming them after the father and his family. Are children named at birth, or did they wait till they were a year or two old before they were named?
You know, that's an excellent question. They were named at birth because it was basically a given what their name was going to be, because so your name is based on your family.
Julius II dies, and then another baby comes along. Would they be Julius III, or would they go back to Julius II?
You know what? That is a really good question. And I think probably they would keep the number system depending on how old maybe the children were, because you get these adult Romans who have names like, Quintus, like they're like the fifth, but they're, many of their brothers have died, like they'll be the last one left. So I imagine it was up to the individual family and probably dependent on how old the child actually was. Like if a child is going to be, Antonia, the second, and dies, a few weeks after birth, then that title might go to the next one. So I think it probably was an individual family preference, but that's a very good question. You can just imagine, how confusing the naming practice was. And from what we can see in letters and just little family references, probably everybody just had nicknames. And that was the way they distinguished it. Cicero calls his daughter Tulliola, which is like, little Tullia. There's a daughter of sort of the Augustan royal house who is named Livilla, and sort of Livia is like the family name they're trying to like imitate, like they're trying to reference, but it's more like Little Livia. So probably a lot of them had nicknames to distinguish them, I would guess. Yes?
I read this week that they've discovered many bronze statues in the mud underneath the hot springs in Italy. And the bronze statues have both Etruscan and Roman Latin inscriptions. So apparently the Romans did not force the Etruscans out. They lived there simultaneously. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I can't elaborate on that discovery, but there's discoveries, it seems like every day, which is why teaching ancient history is so fun, because it's in the present, it's not just in the past. But yes, the Romans and the Etruscans were coexisting at the same time, but the Etruscans are eventually conquered entirely by the Romans, to the point that their language dies out. Now, they're not like wholesale slaughtered, like Etruscans just adapt to Roman culture. So they had been they were like a dominant power during the Bronze Age. They had a lot of city-states in Rome, and then by the time we get to like the 1st century BC, we have complete Roman dominance in that area, decline of Etruscan language. One of the reasons we don't know the Etruscan language anymore is because Latin takes over. Now, the alphabets are very similar because they're all based on each other. Like the Etruscan alphabet is based on the Greek alphabet, which is based on the Phoenician alphabet. So the written language is similar, but the spoken languages were different. The Etruscan language is a bit of a mystery, like to all linguists. It's not an Indo-European language, and there's a lot of different theories among linguists as to where it actually comes from. But we don't we don't really know it. We know a certain amount of words, mainly from inscriptions that have to do with funerals. So most of our knowledge of the Etruscan language comes from, it has to do with death or funerals or something like that, so it's not complete. Now, Etruscans, though, even though the Romans become the dominant power, the Etruscan city-states are taken over, the language dies out, they have sort of this great cameo in Roman history that will never be forgotten, because what the Etruscans were, they're famous for a lot of things, but one of the things that the Romans admired about the Etruscans was their ability to interpret the will of the gods in nature. So that idea of looking at vultures to determine who should be king, that was an Etruscan idea. And they also very famously would sacrifice animals and read the organs to determine the will of the gods. So that's something that the Romans adopt from them, and that becomes its own body of knowledge that the Romans build on. And so the Etruscans were known to the Romans as people who can predict the future. And when Julius Caesar very famously is told to beware the Ides of March by, we know the famous translation soothsayer, it's an Etruscan kind of teller of the wills of the gods who tells him that. And then when he meets him again on that fateful day, and Caesar says, the Ides of March are here, and he says, I, Caesar, but not yet gone. That's meant to be an Etruscan. So they have a great cameo in Roman history. Sure. Now, I actually have a lot of pictures of Etruscan artifacts and things like that I will hopefully show you next class.
Thank you.
Sure. Great. One more question. Yes.
I think I've read that in the 1st century AD, about 40% of the Roman Empire were slaves, and I wondered if that jives with what you know.
So I don't know that I could say one way or the other what the percentage was, but not to be very general about it, there were a lot of slaves. And I don't know about what percentage in what particular century, but the amount of slaves really increases during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC is when we get this giant influx of slaves, because the Romans that's like a huge period of conquest. And that's when they're sort of encountering cultures that really rely on slave labor. So I can't really say about percentages, but we do see what kind of effect it has on Roman society. So in some ways, Livy's descriptions of this sort of early Roman world where every man is a citizen and has his own farm and defends it, that's almost like this nostalgic hearkening for a world that no longer exists, because by the time Livy is writing, there aren't a ton of small farmers anymore. There are huge estates run by very wealthy men who rely on imported slave labor, and most small farms have fallen apart and can't keep up with that. So that leads to kind of an influx of former small farmers into the cities where they take on other trades, and it probably leads to a great deal of the social dissatisfaction that fuels the final decades of the Republic. All right, so I think that is enough for today. I should say that what we talk about in these little 1-hour classes, I usually take a semester to go over, so I don't mean to rush from topic to topic. And if you want to ask me to elaborate about anything, or you want more references, then please let me know, and I will see you next Thursday. Thank you.